Welcome everyone to the Sex Scandals in Religion live web chat with series producers and directors Robin Benger and Peter Kavanagh. I'm Damali Kai-Littlewhite, the online community manager for the Sex Scandals in Religion website on the Earthbook TV platform. I'll be assisting our moderator for tonight's event, Christopher Sumpton. The format for the evening. We will first hear from Robin and Peter, who will introduce the four-part series, how it came about, and some of the challenges they had in producing it. They will respond to questions from the moderator. Then we'll take questions from you, our online audience. To ask a question at any time, simply type your question into the question box within the GoToWebinar control panel on the right side of your screen. Our moderator tonight is Christopher Sumpton of Cogent Benger Productions, the producers of the series. Chris teamed up with Robin Benger to form Cogent Benger Productions in 1999 so they could produce socially relevant and issue-oriented films. Our panelists are Robin Benger, a producer, director, writer, and narrator of television documentaries. Born in England, raised in South Africa, he's been working in Canadian journalism and documentary filmmaking since 1976. Individuality, unpredictability, relevance, rich characters, and a strong instinct for narrative are the qualities Robin aims for in Cogent Benger documentaries. Robin was a series editorial producer and, in the name of Ayatollah, director. Peter Kavanagh, a director and writer who has been responsible for some of the most memorable programming on the CBC, including The Fifth Estate, Land and Sea, and The Sunday Edition. He's a freelance writer for the Globe and Mail, The Washington Times, The Irish Catholic, to name a few. Peter has consulted with universities around the world and written a number of books on politics and social issues. Peter was the series editorial director. Now, let's begin the Sex Scandals in Religion live web chat.
Well, basically, we're an independent documentary production company, and we pitch most of our documentaries, and we pitched a documentary about celibacy to Vision, and Vision called us up and said, no, we don't want celibacy, we'd like sex scandals in religion. So Peter, who's almost a world authority on the Catholic sex scandals, and I looked at each other and said, let's not do the Catholics. And then Peter researched all these other religions which had, you know, some kind of sexual scandal, sexual abuse story in it. And it was a fascinating process because, to be quite honest, initially, we weren't over the moon about the title. And, you know, we're not really into tabloid television. So Peter's research yielded, I think, more than a dozen cases. And do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, you know, one of the things that, as Robin says, our original idea was on celibacy, and the idea, what we were thinking about in terms of celibacy is, can you explain within the Catholic context why the sex abuse of children was taking place? And of course, one of the things that's tossed around really easily is the idea that it's the culture of celibacy within the Catholic Church that results in the sex abuse. And when Vision indicated that they were more interested in sex scandals than religion, and we started to investigate the various other faiths that had sex scandals. One of the things that we discovered, of course, was that celibacy didn't actually seem to be the issue. You actually had scandals, you actually had abuse, you actually had sex abuse taking place in situations in which celibacy never came up. And that's one of the things, as Robin says, that it came rather fascinating because it led us down this path in which we tried to figure out, okay, if it's not celibacy, if it's not about sex, what's going on here? What's the link, if any, between this notion of sex abuse and religion itself?
And one of the commonalities which we found interesting, because now we had something we get our teeth into, the intransigence of the nature of the reaction of many of these religions to a miscreant Swami or Lama or preacher. And the other thing we found, which I thought was intriguing, was the extent to which the victim of a sexual assault in a religion has a sort of double jeopardy problem. And there's a particular sort of hellish silence that descends on a lot of these lives, and a lot of these people being young and trusting so wholeheartedly in these religious leaders don't achieve justice in the sense that they deserve in the society.
You know, Robin sort of raised a really interesting point here, which is that we discovered a number of things when we looked at these 4 particular religions. We narrowed down the list and we decided that we would look at Islam, we would look at evangelical Christianity, we would look at Buddhism, and we would look at Orthodox Judaism. And these are just some of the issues, some of the religions, some of the examples we could have used, but we decided to zero in on those 4. And what's interesting is that even though those are very different religions and different from Catholicism, they all had these common elements that were taking place. There were young people who were being abused. They were being abused by the most trusted members within their community, the holy men, the people who were revered by society. The reaction in every religion when the sort of accusation of sex abuse came up, the reaction was always the same. There was this denial, there was this refusal to acknowledge it was going on. There was this attempt to blacken the name of the person who raised the issue of sex abuse, to deny that the victim was telling the truth. And then there were ways of trying to sort of cover it up, trying to sort of somehow excuse the behavior of, as Robin put it, the miscreant, the person who had betrayed the fundamental trust. And it's interesting because you're crossing all kinds of boundaries here. You know, in Robin's incredible episode on Islam, right? You know, you're talking about Iran, you're talking about a sort of a Middle Eastern culture, you're talking about something that's far removed from the evangelical Christian atmosphere of Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States as you can get, and yet commonalities are just astounding.
Is the internal process of addressing these very, very serious allegations were, to put it bluntly, a whitewash. In the case of the Iranian rape victims, there were 3 inquiries which were essentially all trumped by the supreme religious authority, which exonerated the rapists. In the case of the Orthodox Jewish victims, rabbinical courts are a law unto themselves. In the case of the Buddhist example, there was every indication that there was a sort of internal hesitancy, I think might be the euphemism, to address this. And in the case of the Atlanta evangelical, very interesting, the one example of the 4 where it actually went out into the secular judicial system, and the result was the settlement.
It's a settlement that is dismissed with prejudice, which is a convoluted way of saying, well, we've reached the settlement, and everybody's agreed that we're not going to talk about this, we're not going to say what happens, and it's never going to come up again. Now, there are all kinds of rumors that are circulating about what did or didn't happen in the settlement with in terms of Bishop Long,
how much money
was involved, what kinds of admission of responsibility, if any, took place, what kind of liability, if any, took place.
We'll never know.
And and in a very strange way, as Robin says, in the one case, and this is the one case of the 4, in the one case where it actually leaves the realm of the church and enters into the secular world in terms of seeking some sort of understanding, some sort of sense of justice, some sort of resolution, some sort of, what's the word, closure. What we end up with is a situation that is as mysterious, as cloaked in ritual and arcane language, as removed from open exposure as any of the other cases that we dealt with.
And I think that's the most troubling discovery that we made in this series.
Okay, we have a question from New York City on the Orthodox Judaism episode. Nama Yehuda asks, what are some ways to help communities manage shame, disillusionment, and reality while supporting victims and their families?
Well, thanks for the question. The director of that episode, Alan Mendelsohn, did an excellent job, and he's not here, but if you send us your email, we can certainly pass it on to Alan. He will in turn send back to you the various organizations, one of which is called Survivors for Justice. There are a community of psychologists and psychiatrists and police officers in the piece who are profoundly concerned about this. And one of the things we went to great lengths to say was clearly each one of these religions, the majority of adherents are law-abiding, concerned about morality, very protective of children, the majority in all four of these religions. But clearly there is a move, and we caught the story at a very interesting point. There was a public community meeting that Alan filmed, and there is clearly a mood to deal with this. And in fact, in the Buddhist episode, one of the victims said, we love this religion, basically. You just have to be honest about the people who are besmirching the religion, and we have to do something about it.
You know, if you go to the Sex Scandals in Religion website where you found the notice of this webinar tonight, you'll find that there are resources. Available. There are contact addresses and email addresses. But as Robin said, if you send us an email, we can actually provide you with further information. I just wanted to add to what Robin was saying that, you know, in every one of these situations, you encounter different degrees of difficulty in terms of organizing a response within the community. Within the Buddhist community, for instance, Buddhism is a very diverse, diffuse, non-hierarchical religion in which so-called centers of authority are everywhere and nowhere. Within evangelical Christianity, there are loose affiliations of churches, but the churches are themselves powers unto themselves. When you're talking about Iran, you're talking about one of the world's existing theocracies in which the dividing line between the power of the state and the power of the religion is actually almost non-existent.
In all religions, clearly the quality of forgiveness is an amazingly therapeutic principle. I come from South Africa, and Nelson Mandela was the world champion of forgiveness, and I saw how that healed one of the most abusive societies in history. So I think that that's an area which we really didn't get into, the spiritual conceptual thing in all of these religions, and this doubles the how perplexed one becomes at the reaction of the authorities. You would think that that forgiveness and healing would be a primary thing in their minds, instead of essentially covering up and internally, cleansing trying to wish the thing away.
We have a follow-up question also from Nama Yehuda in New York. What are the similarities and differences that were found between the insular communities discussed in the 4 episodes?
Well, the similarities are actually more numerous than the differences. I want to reiterate something Robin said just a few minutes ago. In every one of these cases, and in most religions in the world, the power of the religion is that it brings joy, relief, consolation, sort of in a sense of purpose and understanding of the universe to millions and millions upon fascinated true believers. And most of the people involved in the religions don't abuse one another. But in each one of these cases, what you have are situations in which, number one, the victims all have a sort of a certain similarity about themselves, in the sense that they tend to be vulnerable individuals in a psychological or an emotional state or a political state in which they are vulnerable to outside pressures, force of compulsion, the interference of authorities. They're easily shunned. They're easily sort of made to appear weak. They're easily made to appear as if they might be lying about this and what have you. Now, number two, the people who are the abusers share certain characteristics as well. They're individuals who like to exercise power, who see themselves as being somewhat special and aloof from the community, therefore in a situation in which pretty much satisfying their own desires function in the world. They go along. And thirdly, the other similarity which is really important is that these are very tight communities. These are communities that see themselves as self-sufficient. In the Iranian case, it's, you know, everything is about the state and the religion, and those things are really powerfully connected, and they're surrounded by enemies, and there's, you know, and so they see this sense of, like, you know, we can do anything, but we have to protect ourselves against slanders that will come from the outside. The same is true of a small Buddhist community that just sort of exists and thinks, okay, we've found the true path, we've found the path to enlightenment, and we have to resist those who will actually try and take us off the path. I mean, the similarities just run all the way through. In fact, they overwhelm any potential differences.
We have a comment and a question from Walid Al-Ahmad regarding the Iranian episode. He says, first I would like to congratulate you on a very nice piece of work concerning the episode about Islam. You know that the Iranis are Shia, which represent 10 to 15% of Muslims, and they're a relatively new sect of Islam. The majority of Muslims are Sunni, where there's no such thing as clergy.
We are also aware of several well-documented incidents in which within Sunni communities, the sex abuse of young people, both men and women, the use, the sort of perversion of sex by, if not clergy, as we normally understand that term, by religious authorities, is actually something that we could have investigated. We looked at this particular case because the Iranian case brings together a bunch of different issues that weren't present in the other episodes. The most important of which is that in the case of the Iranian abuse that Robin documented so well in his episode, what we're talking about is what happens when religion and the state become not only aligned, but almost inseparable.
Okay, let's talk for a minute about the process of making the series. Robin, were there any dangerous moments in terms of producing these episodes?
Well, I think when you take on a subject like this, sex and religion is like fuel and fire. You know you're going to poke a hornet's nest. We were all very cool through the whole thing. We also were very cognizant of the fact that we'd be walking into some potentially litigious waters. So we were very, very diligent about the legal and journalistic scrutiny and fact-checking and just balance and the fairness about the whole process. As for danger, I was in a situation in a small town in Turkey where the police in the community came to my hotel room to shake us down because, as it had been explained to us, if we applied for a permit to film nationally in Turkey, it would be one thing, but we would have to then report to the regional authority and the municipal chief of police in these communities where they've located the Iranian refugees. So we structured the whole shoot so it was very much fast and in and out and targeted to the people we needed to speak to. But all the same, obviously somebody saw us and came to my hotel room and tried to shake us down. But I had given some money to the refugees, and so once they left, I said to everyone, we're out of here. So we left this town in the dead of night. I said to the guy who knocked on my door, well, I'll see you for breakfast, but we're really tired now. And we hightailed out of town. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the police raided the refugees, or the biggest community of refugees that we had gotten to know, took them into detention, held them until 2 o'clock the next day, and deprived them of the money that they sorely needed, that I had given them, because they needed to eat. So, you know, I mean, we're very experienced here, and, you know, sometimes you have to, you know, hit a wall and deal with it accordingly. Each one of the directors were extremely professional and had stresses. There were threats in one case. There was threats in the other case, and certainly we were told to get the hell out of town a number of times on the evangelical story. But, you know, to do this work and to put together documentaries from this particular nexus, this particular vein of modern history, requires that you keep your head down and finish the job.
Robin's case with the Iranian refugees right on the border of Turkey and Iran, you're actually talking about a physical danger that is palpable and can result in injury and perhaps even death. On another level, I don't think any of these episodes were easy for the directors to be involved with. You know, you have real, true victims who are emotionally crumbling as they try and come to grips with real abuse that has changed and affected their lives. You're dealing with real communities that are in turmoil, who are trying to sort of like circle around and understand how it is that they actually reach some sort of accommodation with themselves. And you have these situations in which you want to make sure that you actually get the thing right, but also that you give due acknowledgement to the fact that there are real people's lives at the heart of each one of these stories.
I would like to add one more thing. I'm interested in Peter's response to this, but we caught these religions in the same way that I think the first wave of sex scandals in the Catholic Church caught the Catholic Church. Now, of course, it's all about healing and it's all about addressing all of these issues, although it's a complicated story. Here they still had the reaction, how dare you? We're a world unto ourselves. These are our laws. We have our own sense of justice. We're not going to answer your questions. It was quite old-fashioned in a way. It
is, and you know, there's a sense in which the Catholic Church may actually be a groundbreaker in this. You know, the Catholic Church, the first wave of true sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church started to emerge in the mid-1980s. And you saw this wave, and it sort of washed over North America from the mid-1980s till mid-1990s, latter part of the 20th century. Then around 2002, it sort of emerges again, especially out of Boston in the United States, and then it sort of starts over the next 10 years to wash all over the world. And as Robin said, you know, it's the focus has now changed in the sense of no longer is the exposure or documentation of an instance of sexual abuse the surprise. Now the question is, how do you actually respond to it? What do you do? How do you deal with it? And things like that. But the reaction of the religions that we're talking about in this series are largely how the Catholic Church reacted in the 1980s. You know, it's sort of along the lines of, you know what? We don't believe this. These folks are lying. This is a calumny. This is an attempt to besmirch the reputation. We don't have to answer this. We're a religion. You're just a secular media outlet. We don't have to sort of respond.
Multiple
you know, exactly. Well, and speak for yourself, Robin. But what we're actually seeing now, I think, is, and I think Robin's hit on something, which is that this is not a story that's going to go away. And the fact that much of the Catholic story is actually known in broad outline and actually known in fine detail is sort of just, I think, an example of what's going to happen to other religions. You know, the Buddhist story, for instance, to use the example of the Buddhist story, it is not, and as Stephen Batchelor says in the documentary, when Stephen Batchelor talks about people having to be able to discern between the Lama or the Buddhist master who is actually the serial abuser versus the person who's just there trying to guide people into a path towards enlightenment, there's a clear indication there, even when he talks about that meeting in which, you know, the dozens of senior leaders of the Buddhist faith had gathered together to talk about teachers who were perhaps abusing and taking advantage of vulnerable students throughout the West. Well, that was just one sort of hint that the problem there is not going to go away. And you see this in the evangelical Christianity piece that Peter Finley did. You see this pattern of abuse that takes place within so-called Protestant Christian faiths, in which there are some serious thinkers within Protestant Christianity who say, you know, the abuse scandal is no less within Protestant Christianity than it is within the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church just gets the attention right at the moment. It doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist, the fact that it doesn't pop up everywhere.
Okay, let's go back to some of the questions that have been coming in. We have one from Michelle Chang in Hamilton regarding the evangelical episode. Have you had any feedback about the show from Eddie Long's ministry?
Peter Finley, the director of the Eddie Long episode, is currently in Turkey on another documentary, but we were working closely together on that. We basically threw all the marbles at New Birth Church, from the very beginning, just begging them to respond in some way. There has been no reaction, to my knowledge, and I guess I would know if there has been, to the documentary that went out. They've been kind of focused in Atlanta on the settlement and the consequences of the settlement and the reverberations from the settlement. I thought it was very fascinating. The settlement was reached on Friday, announced on Friday, and the broadcast, of course, was last night. And I was very interested in watching the documentary in the wake of the settlement, because what Peter found within the black evangelical community in Atlanta was a sense of, we know what's been going on and we will not pass judgment, but I think the empty pews in his church say it all. Now, it'll be very interesting, because Peter's brought this up too, is one of the big turning points in the career of an evangelical is, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and you know,
so that's a big show.
It's interesting because the story that Peter Finley documents with the case of Bishop Long is one of these classic, and just to go back to Robin's point, and Christopher, your comment earlier, it's one of those classic things, you know, like the immediate reaction. There are rumors within the community that something might not be quite right. There's allegations that something is going on. These are denied by the sort of leadership of the church. The church says, no, you can't possibly be besmirching the name of a great pastor. You know, there's a court case, a lawsuit launched in which people say this is what happened, and there's details of very explicit, very fine details in terms of exactly how the abuse took place, and there's a denial that that's true. There's this immediate sort of, you know, this is a lie, I'll fight every one of these charges aren't true, and then there's this curtain of silence that falls down on everything as people people retreat behind closed doors, and then there's this final ending to the story in which somebody says, you know, we're not going to talk about this anymore, but it's over. And as Robin says, you know, if you look at the story of evangelical Christianity over the past 125 years, especially in America, if you look at the story of evangelical Christianity, what you have is the rise and fall of many a great preacher, in which the story of a great preacher begins sort of very modestly, you know, as in a small church with 10 pews and 27 parishioners. You build up to mega status, then there's some sort of sexual crisis, an infidelity, there's a collapse. But if nothing else about evangelical Christianity, there is a second act in evangelical Christianity, and the second act is, of course, within evangelical Christianity, one of the fundamentals of the faith is you can be reborn, you can be forgiven, you can move on past a great sin. That's the stage in which you sort of sit there and say, okay, at what point does this turn again on a dime in which there is an apology? Again, we have no idea what's going on in the minds of the church. We have no idea what's going on in the minds of Bishop Long. We have no idea what's going on in the minds of the victims of this particular case, because all we have is a statement to the effect of, and remember, this is in the context, as Peter Finley demonstrated, this is in the context of a minister standing up and saying aloud publicly, these are all lies. I will fight this to the bitter end. I will demonstrate that this is not true. And
David versus Goliath.
I'm David versus Goliath. I have 5 stones.
I ain't thrown one yet.
Yes. And what do we end up with? We end up with a very simple statement saying this lawsuit has been dismissed with prejudice, which in itself is this remarkably fascinating line that needs to be decoded.
Yeah, what does it mean with prejudice?
All it means with prejudice is that it's done with. They can't bring it up again. But all that means is, in U.S. legal terms, all that means is, look, you bring a lawsuit, we reach a settlement. Part of the settlement is you agree you can never bring up those facts again. It doesn't say anything about whether or not there was any admission of liability. It doesn't say anything about how much, what kind of damages, if any, were paid out. It doesn't say anything about the decision. All it says is you agree never to raise those issues again.
Let's go back to the Islam episode again. There's been some interest in what happened to the participants. First of all, where were they when you interviewed them, and what's happened to them since? And also, why were some of them, their identities disguised and some were not? Robin.
I don't feel comfortable saying the towns that we were in, so I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to plead the fifth. I'll take the fifth, whatever they say. One of the people we profiled in the documentary was a man of memorable courage. I've met a lot of people over a long career, I guess about 30 years, and every now and then you hit a tuning fork with somebody's purity of purpose, and there was a gay man in his late 40s, Ali Reza, and he was offered the option of being unidentifiable, and he said, no, I want to be seen. And he was a very compelling interview, and living in real squalor and trying to retain his self-esteem. He's now living in the United States, and I'm honestly not sure whether I'm at liberty to say where. But he's got out. The young woman who was in the silhouette, her refugee claim was in process when I left, and I'm not sure, to be quite honest, whether she's gotten out yet, but it was going in a positive direction, the last I heard. And the other question, that was
Just where they were now, but I think you've answered that. Okay. Peter, maybe you could talk about the concept of soul murder that comes up from one of the interviewees.
Sexual abuse is a horror wherever it takes place. And in fact, one of the things, just to go back to something, and I think that this really does need to be stressed, because Robin has pointed it out, and I've pointed out, that in the actual context of religion, the overwhelming majority of people's experiences with religion are positive, beneficial, and helpful to them as individuals. And in fact, in a very weird way, the amount of sexual abuse that takes place within religions is actually lower than the amount of sexual abuse that takes place in other institutions in society. I mean, generally speaking, religious figures actually tend to be less likely to abuse children than other people, which is how we work our way into the concept of soul murder. And the way we work ourselves into the concept of soul murder is there is something about the sexual abuse that takes place within the religious context that adds a layer of horror to the sexual abuse itself. Sexual abuse is the violation, the physical and emotional violation of an individual. When it takes place within the religious context, what you're actually doing is you're robbing a third dimension of the individual. These are individuals who actually believe that the people who conducted the abuse are people who aspire to a higher level of conduct and living than the ordinary individual. They adorn themselves with the mantle of God and sanctity. And to be abused by someone who actually is given the accolades and honors of being a religious, holy individual, and who uses this in aid of their own sort of sexual assaults, results in a sort of a form of abuse that sort of trumps. No, actually, you can't trump abuse. You can't compare abuse. But that's one of the reasons we talk about soul murder, is that the soul murder is another thing that happens here. It's not just the violation of the body. It's not just the breaking of the human spirit. It's also the crushing of the soul.
And just one thing added to that, it was very interesting to find out in practically all the cases where the abuser, having had his way, would say to the victim, now don't tell anybody about this, which, was another interesting commonality, threatening silence.
What's the plans for distribution of this show? Will it be on DVD, online?
I think you should answer that question.
Okay.
That actually is in your alley.
Christopher Sumpton, the executive producer, who deals with all these kind of details.
The plans are that it will run as a streaming video online on Vision TV's website within a few weeks after the broadcast, which will be soon. DVDs will be available eventually through our own website, cogentbenger.com. Outside of Canada, we're not yet sure because we're looking for a broadcaster in the U.S., for example. So whether it be by broadcast or whether it will be released online in the U.S. and internationally, we don't know for sure yet.
But we do have a distributor, Looking Glass International.
That's right.
In Australia, and they have the sort of international rights for distribution.
Okay. Robin, maybe you could speak about the risk and rarity of this kind of investigative filmmaking in independent television.
Well, that's a kind of a business question. I don't know if people are interested in that or whether it will be illuminating, but what do you learn from a series like this? And television is mostly about reality shows, drama, entertainment, puffery, and the dark, edgy, probing, I hope well-produced documentary in the independent or private sector is a rare thing, and obviously I want to credit Joan Jenkinson at Vision and the people there for backing us up and for doing this kind of programming, because I think there's certainly, public broadcasting has their flagship programs, and here I talk about the CBC's Fifth Estate and Frontline at PBS and a couple of British and European programs, but really it's an endangered species. And in the private sector, in the what I call the private or independent or commercial networks, I really take my hat off to people who back this kind of sensibility. I think it's really important amidst all the froth.
Do you think it's likely, Robin, that there'll be more episodes? We've done Islam, Orthodox Judaism, Buddhism, and the evangelical Christianity community. Do you think there could be others? Is there enough material?
There's no question that even at the first pass, the first research phase for the first series, Peter rustled up an extraordinary number of stories. And we've been contacted by various organizations around the world who've heard about this through the internet, who are in the business. So there's no question that there are other stories out there. There's no question that we figured out a formula, if you will, for telling them, and that we had a great team, the editors, the shooters, Mike Grippo, Greg Hopen, Bowman, and Mike Mason. It was interesting, too, to think about how you're going to tell a story at the, almost definitely the pre-production phase. I mean, Peter is a wonderful man of ideas, and I like to work that way very much, because if I'm not gripped with the idea, and to a certain extent seized with the righteousness of doing it, then I have no time for, I mean, don't come and knock on Cogent Ben's door for, you know, I painted my grandmother's cottage, or whatever it might be.
I mean, you know, look, what's interesting here is there is no, unfortunately, there is no shortage of miscreant behavior in the world. If there's a constant in sort of the human experience, it is that there are bad people who do really bad things out there. The interesting thing about that is to figure out why they do it and how they get away with it, and what it is about what they're doing that shocks and dismays us. Could we tell more stories about sex scandals in religion? Oh yeah, you could probably actually
expand it to cults.
Yeah.
3 seasons.
Yeah, I mean, you could, you know, and that's it. I mean, that's the thing. It's the, you know, it's what kind of interest is there in it.
No, I think at the end of the day, I mean, I wonder. One question I have on this and Peter's is that does this mean that religion is further weakened by this series? And we live in a very, very fragmented world when it comes to religion. And I think, unfortunately, it probably does. The second thing is that the thought has occurred to me that you could have a global commission which would look at this issue and say, okay, folks, the gig's up as far as sexual abuse and sex scandals in religions because of the commonalities. Wouldn't you think? I don't know if there is any international body or commission that would look at all these things and say it's the same old story, you know. And you can't, or maybe this is another fascinating thing. What is the line between God and man, you know? Should secular justice prevail in all of these cases globally? Well, of course, Iran wouldn't like that at all. So,
you know,
including quite...
You would think, I mean, I understand exactly why you say this, you know, the more details that come out about corruption in religion, you would think, who would... The reality is that the world actually grows more religious all the time. You know, the truth is that the world becomes more religious, not less religious. The more details that come out about the inequities, the more details that come out about the wrong-headedness of some religious leaders or some religious practices or whatever, the more religious the world becomes. I mean, religion is one of those cornerstones. You know, it's an odd thing about globalization. Globalization was always thought to be one of those practices that would actually eliminate the local. It would actually sort of like create this situation in which we were all one.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, one of the consequences of globalization tends to be to intensify the local. And one of the ways that you intensify this sort of local, one of the ways that you understand your own identity, I think your idea of, if, for want of a better phrase, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it came to religion is actually a fascinating idea. The question...
You have wise people and
you could have wise people and you know...
What, give them a screening.
You know, the difficulty is that people who are open to actually sort of trying to ponder what it is that went wrong are the minority. For the most part, you have for the most part, and you see this in the series. It's interesting. You see this in the series, right? You have people who are willfully blind to the potential that their religion could be involved in wrongdoing. And you have people who are so touched and horse-scarred by the experience that they want nothing more to do with religion. And you have these two extremes. But the people who try and sort of like navigate this line where they can actually still be believers and still be open and cognizant of the abuse that's taking place, they become this very rare group of people. And, you know, having said that, you know, you watch Catholics leave the Catholic Church in droves. But when Catholic, you know, one of the things that's interesting is that when Catholics leave the Catholic Church as a result of the clerical sex abuse scandals, what you find is that they don't leave religion. They become Anglicans. They join other religions. They become Buddhists, right? You know, and when people leave Buddhism, they don't actually become non-believers. They go into another faith. I mean, so that's the thing. It's not that it has no impact on a particular group of people or on a particular faith. It's just that in a global sense, the amount of sort of religious fervor in the world actually doesn't seem to decline.
I have another question from New York, from Nama Yehuda. Could you speak on the issue of shame and disillusion in these communities, possibly as part of the underlying need to keep things secret and or minimized?
That is a great question. I can certainly, as being read to me, I think it's a very powerful factor, and I found it in a very interesting way in the Iranian story. When I spoke to the Iranians, they sort of ran for cover.
You know, the idea of shame, as Robin points out, is a very powerful motivator in terms of human behavior. And one of the things about sex abuse generally is that shame is often the factor that actually allows sex abuse to be hidden, that allows sex abuse not to come to light. There's all kinds of evidence that in sex abuse situations, regardless of the context, that one of the things that happens is the victims don't come forward. Families and communities don't acknowledge that the sex abuse has taken place. There is a sense that people are truly ashamed of what's going on, and it becomes secret. It becomes something that festers within. Shame keeps a lot of things hidden, and probably this is a huge factor in why the sex abuse scandal in religions is actually difficult to document and actually difficult to bring to the surface.
Actually one of the 4 episodes is about sex abuse of children. But is there a special or specific power dynamic between holy men and children that is a factor here?
You know, it's interesting you should bring this up. Just last week in the United States, 10 days ago now, I guess, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops released the second volume of what's known as the John Jay Report, which is this sort of analysis of the clerical abuse scandal that took place in the United States. And one of the issues that's raised is, why is it children? Why is it children that are being abused, right? And within the context of the Catholic Church, one of the conclusions that the John Jay scholars actually reach is that it was children because they're actually the most readily available and the most vulnerable. And in Alan Mendelssohn's piece in terms of the Orthodox Judaism community, the children were the most vulnerable. They were sort of like there, and people could prey on the children. I think what's interesting about the three other episodes in this series and about sex abuse period is that these are literally crimes of opportunity. It's, you know, people commit the abuse, people commit the crimes with the people that they can actually take advantage of. You know, I mean, and there's different motivations that are going on there. So that's not the only thing that's going on. Because this is, you know, in many respects, not just about sex. This is about power. This is about corruption. This is about imposing your will on others.
I think we both probably had some kind of related experience in this way, but I know in my history and tradition, the child in Anglicanism and in Christianity is the most fragile and the most precious resource that mature religious people have on earth. And in English tradition, the image of the role of the choir boy and choir boys and choir masters and the innocence of beauty, like Benjamin Britten, you know, the story of Benjamin Britten, which people might be familiar with, always comes to mind. And I think that pedophiliacs, if that's the right word, are obviously across the board. I mean, but here they're in environments where they have captive, innocent children, and their parents are often reluctant, obviously at a young age, to tell them about sex. So the priest favors them and cultivates them, and although pedophilia is a universal, what you call it, malfunction, it manifests itself in churches, male-dominated churches, where there are power relations. It's almost like a fox in the
Fox in the Hat.
Yeah.
But just to take
somebody said that in the Jewish piece. That,
just to take Robin's point one step further, right? Okay, look. An irony of these stories is that there is a corruption of the most important element that's going on, right? In the Buddhist story, the women allege that they were actually abused by the person who was their master, their guide to enlightenment. Within the sort of context of Buddhism, there is no more important relationship than that between the master and the student. And therefore, the sort of corruption takes place right at the crux of the relationship. In Bishop Long's story, right? Bishop Long is this man who has made his reputation a national reputation, attempting to root out homosexuality. And he sees this as the great danger to the family and the community. And what is the allegation? 4 young men with troubled relationships with their fathers, looking for a sort of a strong role model, allege that he violates that very relationship. So in that sense, you have this sort of like very sort of key concept within the Bishop Long story, in which, just as within the Buddhist master and student story, you see the sort of fundamental linchpin of the relationship actually being the spot in which the corruption takes place. In Islam, especially in the sort of the story of Iran, what you're actually, you have a state, you have a religion that insists that nothing is more important to society than the sanctity of the women. And what do? We find a situation in which they use rape as a tool. We see a situation in which rape is used as a tool for political purification, for sort of, and in the Orthodox Judaism story, we come somewhat full circle to Robin's earlier point about within Christianity this notion that the child is most precious, right? In which we see again one of the most fundamental pieces of the sort of story being told is actually not only one of the most fundamental pieces, but it is the source and focal point of the corruption itself.
All of the sex scandals involve men as the alleged perpetrators. Why are there no stories involving women in this role?
Well, we could tell stories about women who are the perpetrators of sex scandals in religion. Doesn't particularly fit within the 4 episodes that we did, but there are all kinds of examples of this. It's not, see, when you start moving about within this field, you have to be really careful about the assumptions that are made, because the assumptions don't actually stand up. Right? It's not celibacy. It's not, I mean, without doubt. Look, one of the reasons males predominate in sex scandals in religion is that, for the most part, all of the religions that you can turn to in the world are dominated by males. So it's actually it's a question of odds. I mean, if the vast majority of people in positions of authority and power within a religious structure are male, the vast majority of people who are the abusers will be male.
But across the board, sexual abuse is more the province of men, isn't it?
Well, sure, but generally speaking, but sex abuse committed by women is not unheard of, not undocumented,
more the cases of the teachers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We have another question from Walid Al-Ahmad. Robin, do you think that people get disappointed because they take clergy as representatives of God?
You know, it may be good enough for millions of people in several major religions, but it's a hard act to really carry off. I actually, at a certain point in my life, was presented with the way to have a career in religion, and it scared the hell out of me, to be quite honest. But I have known great, when I think of the anti-apartheid clerics in South Africa, of which Desmond Tutu is obviously the icon. When I think of Jesuits who I met in the field in El Salvador in the war down there, all over the world, I mean, I've come across some of the most stellar people I've met have gotten their strength from their belief in God. If they think they're the direct representatives of God, I just think by definition they're setting themselves up for a fall. And it's one of the things that bothers me about religion and about demagoguery too, is when a population that's desperate, in desperate circumstances, worships a leader and places them on a pedestal. It's always problematic, whether it's Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings or Winston Churchill, or there's going to be some anger about this, but Muammar Gaddafi. Churchill obviously believed in democracy, and I think that's one of the great things about a functioning democracy, that a lot of us in these functioning democracies perhaps don't value as much as it should be, that if you lose the election, you're out. It's very, very difficult to have a form of demagoguery in a country like Canada. And to this end, I had an amazing conversation with a mullah in southern Iraq, and I explained to him the division or the separation of powers, that in Canada we guarantee freedom of religion in our constitution. But if he got into power, he said that everything would be run according to the Quran. And I said, does that include the oil industry? He said, absolutely. We have ways of running the petroleum industry in Iraq based purely on Quranic principles. So it's easy for me to say, in my experience of the role of religion in political situations and in countries, when they're in charge, it's not a good idea. I'd much rather guarantee the freedom of religion, and to come back to this global commission idea, I think that you could probably extend that to have some kind of a study or some kind of a universal clearinghouse. It's a good question, though, eh?
Yeah.
I mean, they say the best form of government is a benevolent dictatorship, and if you believe that the person represents God, I mean, we were at the Vatican on another project, Peter and I, and you go into one of those great religious buildings, and it's like the hustle of slippers, that sound of devotion.
That is the sound of devotion.
And it's enormously fortifying, even for an agnostic like me. I get it. It's very powerful. You have the blind trust of millions of loving, lovely people. You see the little Italian lady in the Duomo in Florence, who's just completely fortified. A friend of mine, a great cameraman we know, his mother climbed up the steps of the cathedral in Quebec. They were a very poor family. He came from a very large family. Every day, our cameraman actually on this shoot, Michael Grippo, his mother, he told me, goes to Mass, I think, every day.
Sure. I mean, there are millions of people, billions of people
who are fortified enormously,
who get their strength to carry on from religion.
Say no more. Yeah.
Well, on that subject, we have a question from BL, initials BL. After seeing the universality of this problem, do you think there's anything organized religion can do to address the issue of abuse of power by clergy?
Well, I mean, I'm obviously a great believer in disclosure and justice and healing and self-examination, but Peter has studied this subject in terms of, I'd be interested to know what the Catholic...
On the one level, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, as the Pope has said, as the bishops have said, number one, report crimes to the civil authorities, have them prosecuted within the legal system. Number two, take appropriate church reaction within, in which discipline takes place and reactions to and punishments are put out. Sure, there are all kinds of things that churches can and should do, but the circumstances are such that it's probably circumstances are such that it's up to each individual religion to deal with it. I mean, you actually saw that in the piece on Buddhism, in which the argument was made that Buddhists, both Buddhist leaders, but also Buddhist practitioners, needed to come together to confront the issue of abuse within the within the community of Buddhism, in which they actually sort of had to understand the potential for danger and had to understand how to deal with the danger.
Well, I think we're just about wrapped up with the questions we have.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Thank you, everybody. On behalf of the Sex Scandals and Religion website, the Earth Book team, Cogent, Benger, Robin, Peter, Chris, everybody, thank you for being here and answering all of tonight's questions. Remember to sign up on the website if you're not already a member so you can watch the full episodes. You'll be able to listen to this event again. You'll be able to keep up to date of future events, when the series is going to air in other countries, DVDs being available. So sign up. We'll send you an email and let you know. The address for the website is www.sexscandalsinreligion.com. That's www.sexscandalsinreligion.com. Again, new content will continue to be added. We look forward to you helping to grow the Sex Scandals and Religion community. Thank you again, and good night.